Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Samach is the last daf. It ends the 6th parak of the Masechta, parak Shnei Seirei, and it begins the 7th parak Baloi Koyin Gadol. The daf begins by analyzing machlokas, which we've seen in our last Mishnah, as to when the burning of the par and the sire is mitame, the burner, and his clothing. When does that tumah take effect? The Gemara will show the source of the machlokas in each opinion and what they do with the other one's drashos. The Gemara then discusses where the burning happens and introduces a machlokas about the subject and tries to figure out who those tanaim are. Then we get to what level of burning is required until the tumah comes off. Then we get to a Mishnah which ends the parak, and the Mishnah discusses how the Kohen Gadol knew that he's ready to go on to the next step. He had to wait until the Sa'ir L'Azazel actually reached the Midbar, reached the desert. How does he find out about that? And the next parak begins, and that discusses the Kohen Gadol's next steps, which is reading the Parsha of the Yom Kippur Avoda from a Sefer Torah. The Mishnah describes how it works at length, and the Gemara afterwards discusses whether he's allowed to wear Big Day Kahuna for that, and whether he's allowed to wear generally Big Day Kahuna when he's not doing Avodah. So first of all, we're discussing Machlokas, which is seen in our last Mishnah between the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon. The Machlokas is, we know that the par and the sire that have finished their Avodah have to be brought outside the camp into the Makom Hadeshen, the place where the Deshen is burned, and there they are burned, and the one who burns it becomes Tameh and his clothing become Tameh. The question there was, when do they become Tameh? So it will be seen that the Tanna Kamma says that they become Tameh as soon as they leave the Azara, as soon as they leave the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. And according to Rabbi Shimon, they only become Tameh once the fire has burned them completely, once the fire has caught on the par and sire. Once they leave, they're not Tameh, they're not Tameh until much later when the burning actually happens. So the Gemara discusses the Tanna Kamma source. How does he know that as soon as they leave the Hazara? So the Gemara points out that there are 4 different things that are burned outside the camp. Those 4 things are the par and the sire of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. There's the par Kohen HaMashiach. There's the par Ha'eda. And there is the para Aduma. So the Gemara leaves para Aduma to the side for now. The Gemara says that the other 3 things, there's another thing, and that is the deshen, the ash that is in the mizbeach, when it piles up too much, is brought outside to the same spot. So the Gemara refers to 3 things: the par Kohen HaMashiach, the par Ha'eda, and the deshen. The Gemara says each of them, it says that you should burn it, but it's redundant. It says you should burn it, and it says where to burn it, and it's redundant. There's extra phrases there. When it says you should burn the par Kohen HaMashiach, it says to burn it in the place of the Eda, to burn it in the place of the par Ha'eda. But it also says you should burn it outside the camp. Now par Ha'eda, it already said you burn it outside the camp. So it says by the par Ha'eda to burn it outside the camp, and it says by the par Kohen HaMashiach burn it in the same place and outside the camp. So that's repetitive. Doesn't have to say that. And it also says about it that it should be burned in the Makom Hadeshen, the place where the Deshen goes. But the Deshen also says it goes outside the camp. So that's repetitive as well. So why do I need all 3 things? So the Gemara says this to teach me that all 3 of them have to go outside all 3 machanos. They go outside all 3 camps, and that's how when we say outside the camp, it says outside the camp once would have been enough because all 3 of them, it says, are in the same place. But it goes further and it says outside the camp 3 times, one by each of them, to tell me outside 3 camps. So that's how I know that the par Kohen HaMashiach, the par Ha'eda, and the Deshen all have to go outside the camp, outside all 3 camps, outside the Azara, outside the Harabayis, and outside Yerushalayim. We have to go all the way outside Yerushalayim with all these 3 things. Now, Rashi points out that the par and sar and Yom Kippur are linked to the par Kohen HaMashiach and the par Ha'eda through a hekesh. If that's the case, you should be able to learn from those 3, from the par Kohen HaMashiach at least, that the par Kohen Gadol and the par sar is also burned outside all 3 camps. So we have a brayso that asks a question. According to this, the par Kohen HaMashiach and according to this, the par Kohen Gadol and the sar and Yom Kippur should be burned outside all 3 camps. But the pasuk describing them only says you should burn it outside the machaneh. It says V'espar chatas v'esir chatas v'shehuva ezdam l'chapar kodesh yotzi m'chutz l'machane v'sarfu ba'esh. So Risham v'es Pirsham. It's just as take it outside the machane. That implies only outside one camp. It can't be, because we already know that it's outside all three camps. So says the Tanakama, the Mishnah, this is my source. When it says outside the camp, it's not talking about the burning. It's talking about the tumah. It's talking about when the tumah starts, which is the next thing that's mentioned in the pasuk. It says that he becomes tamei then. When it says outside the camp, it's talking about that's when the tumah starts. It's not talking about the burning, it's talking about when the tumah starts. And it says outside the machane. So you see, as soon as you leave the first machane, you are tamei. Now, first machane, first of the azara, that's machane shechina. So that's when the tumah begins. The Gemara now says that's a good source for the Tanakama, but what is Rabbi Shimon going to do with it? Rabbi Shimon says that it does not become tamei. The tumah doesn't begin until the burning, not just as soon as you leave the azara. So when it says, Rabbi Shimon says that the pasuk of Michutz L'Machane by the Par Kohen Gadol and the Sar Kohen Gadol is linking it to the Para Aduma, and it's teaching a halacha from each to the other. The Par and Sayer says clearly it has to be burned outside all three camps. It doesn't say it straight out, but we learn it from the Par Kohen Mashiach and the Par Ha'eda and the Deshen. So we don't know how far outside the camps the paraduma has to be burned. So we learn that through a hekesh based on the words chutz l'machane. It says chutz l'machane here. It says chutz l'machane by paraduma. We link the two halachas, and therefore we know that paraduma also has to be outside all three machanas. Another halacha we learn is we know that the paraduma has to be east of the city. It says that it has to be burnt on nochach pnei ol moed, but we don't know where the par and sayer of Yom Kippur have to be burnt. So therefore, we have this linkage, we have this hekesh, and that teaches me that they also have to be burned east of the city. So now, according to Rabbi Shimon, we have a source. We also know which direction from the city is supposed to be burned. However, the Chachamim don't have that direction, which direction of the city. So what do the Chachamim hold about that? So Gemara answers that by quoting a Brisa. The Brisa says that the Par and Sar are actually burned north of the city. Every Karban Chatas, which is what they are, has to have all its activities north, so they're burned north of the city. So Gemara adds, the Gemara in this Brisa adds that Rabbi Yossi says that it also has to be on the deshen. It says it should be in the place of the deshen, so you have to bring out some ashes from the mizbeach, put them down in the spot north of the city, because that's not the makom deshen. It's not where most of the ashes were. You have to put some ashes down there so that you could fulfill the commandment of ala deshen, and then you burn the par and the sar over there. So Gemara says that. Rabbi Yossi added that implies that the Tanakhama argues with that, who is the opinion that argues and says you don't have to put the deshen down. So Gemara says it's probably Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, because we have a brisa where Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov explains the words al shefach hadeshen yisaref differently. Rabbi Yossi says al shefach hadeshen yisaref means it has to be on the deshen, so you have to put ash down there before you burn it. Rabbi Yossi says no, shefach hadeshen just means it should be sloped. The ashes should run down the hill, it should be sloped. So Gemara says, so you see that Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov does not hold you have to have the deshen there, he's just saying that it has to be sloped. Says the Abaye, not necessarily. It could be that Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov agrees that the deshen has to be there. He's just saying that the Shefach HaDeshen teaches me another halacha, teaches me that it has to be sloped. But we do not know that he argues on Rabbi Yossi and says that the deshen doesn't have to be there. It could be he agrees to that, he's just adding another thing that other Tanaim might not necessarily agree to. Okay. Now the Gemara brings a brisa which discusses which people involved in the burning actually become tamei. So the brisa focuses on the word in the pasuk that says v'hasayref, and it says the sayref is metame, he becomes tamei, not the one who lights the fire, not the one who arranges the wood. The Gemara says, what's a sayref? What's called the burner? Because that's somebody who's physically involved with actually placing the par and the sire in the fire, physically dealing with the par and the sire in the fire. Lighting the fire and arranging the wood does not count. So Gemara says, until what stage of the burning is somebody's involvement make him tamei? So Gemara says that this is a machokes. Goes to Brisa. Tanakama says until it's ash, and also Rabbi Shimon says as long as it's cow. Once it's not cow anymore, then not. So Gemara says what's between them? Where's the stage between them? The stage between them is once the meat is good and burned, but it's still a solid piece of meat. It's not ashes yet. According to the Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, that doesn't qualify as being metame because it's not cow anymore. However, according to the Tanakama, it's not ash yet, therefore it does qualify as burning. Okay, this takes us to the last Mishnah in the parak. The Gemara just has one comment after the Mishnah until the end of the parak. The Mishnah says that it was now time for the Kohen Gadol to continue, but he couldn't continue until he knew that the Sar Mishtalech, the goat that went off the cliff, had gotten to the midbar. It doesn't say he had to know that it went off the cliff, it just says he had to know that it got to the midbar. So the Mishnah says they told the Kohen Gadol, the goat got to the midbar, you could go further. So how did they know? So there's a couple of approaches to how they knew. One approach is that there were a chain of people standing just within sight of each other, and the chain extended all the way out to the cliff, and as soon as he was brought out to the cliff, that person there waved a flag, and a chain of flag waving went all the way back to Yerushalayim until they got the signal that the goat had arrived. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda says that they had a different way of knowing, and that's that it was only 1 mil walk from Yerushalayim until a place called Beis Chidudai. And people who walked him would walk, the people who walked the man who was bringing the goat would walk with him until Beis Chidudai, then they would walk back, they would rest another mil. That's a total of 3 mils travel time. By that time, they knew he was out in the midbar, and they were able to continue with the avoda. It says Rabbi Shmuel says they had a different simon. They had the strip of red wool that was tied on the door of the heichal, and as soon as that turned white, they knew that he was already over the cliff. Like it says in the pasuk, if your sins will be red, they will be whitened like snow. So now the Gemara says that Abaye says this points out a few things. First of all, we know that Beis Chidudai was in the midbar. That's the edge of the midbar. And we know that Rabbi Yehuda holds that it doesn't have to get all the way to Azazel, because Rabbi Yehuda said you just have to wait 3 mil. Now 3 mil is not all the way to the cliff. The cliff was 12 mil according to Rabbi Yehuda from Yerushalayim. So it just had to get. We waited a time of 3 mil, a time to walk to Beis Chidudai and back, and an extra mil. So Beis Chidudai was already the midbar, and they didn't have to get further than the midbar. That's how Abaye says we can understand Rabbi Yehuda's opinion here. That ends the parak. Now we'll begin the next parak, Balei Kohen Gadol, and it describes that the Kohen Gadol began to read from the parsha. So it says how it worked. So it says he had an option what to wear. He could stay in the linen clothing, the white clothing that he wore in the Kodesh Kedoshim. He could stay in those, or he could switch to a different white robe, and not still is a general white cloak or robe. Now, the Gabbai of the shul, there was a shul in Har HaBayis, not in the Beis HaMikdash, but on Har HaBayis. The Gabbai of the shul took the Sefer Torah from the Aron. He gave it to the president of the shul. The president gave it to the Skan Kohen Gadol, the assistant Kohen Gadol, who gave it to the Kohen Gadol himself. He took it from him, and he stood and he read from it. And what did he read? He read Parshas Acher Mos, which describes the Avodah of Yom Kippur, and he read the Parsha in Parshas Emor that describes Yom Kippur itself. Then he rolled it up, held it, and he said, "There's much more here than I've read to you." We'll explain why he said that. And he verbally, by heart, recited the description of the Yom Kippur Karbanos that's found in Parshas Pinchas. We'll explain why he did that. After he finished that, he said 8 brachos. The brachos were Al Torah, that's Berachas HaTorah. Then Al Avoda, that's Ritzein Hashmon Esrei. Hodah is our Modim. Mechilas Avon, he said the bracha which we say on Yom Kippur at the end of the Yom Kippur Shemon Esrei, the bracha of the day. Then he said a separate bracha on the Beis HaMikdash, on Klal Yisrael, on Yerushalayim, on Kohanim, and the rest of the tefillah that he said at the time. Now, the Mishnah ends off and says that somebody who saw the Kohen Gadol when he was reading could not see the burning of the par and the sire because they were too far away. They were not within the eyesight of each other. There was no spot that you could see both of them. Okay, now the Gemara begins, and the Gemara wants to know: are you allowed to wear Bigdei Kahuna whenever you want? The Gemara says, in the fact that he was allowed to wear either Bigdei Kahuna or his own clothing, that proves this is not avoda. You can't wear your own clothing for avoda. Yet he did have the option of wearing Bigdei Kahuna. That means that you could wear Bigdei Kahuna for a time and for an activity which you don't have to wear Bigdei Kahuna. That seems to indicate that Bigdei Kahuna you're allowed to wear whenever you want, and that is not clear. So Gemara says not necessarily. This is not whenever you want. Bigdei Kahuna here he's wearing for something which is preparing. He's getting ready for the avoda that's to follow by reading the parsha. Could be you're only allowed to wear Bigdei Kahuna either for avoda or for preparation for avoda. Now the Gemara quotes the sugya more at length. The Gemara says we have a question. Kohanim allowed to wear a Bigdei Kahuna or not? The Gemara phrases it as, can they be nene from Bigdei Kahuna? Can they use it as clothing? The Gemara brings a couple of proofs. One proof is that we have a Mishnah in Talmud that describes what Kohanim used to sleep in, and it says that they did not sleep in Bigdei Kahuna. They took it off and folded it under their heads. And that seems to indicate that they're not allowed to sleep in Bigdei Kahuna, but they're allowed to do other things. They're allowed to eat in the Bigdei Kahuna. Versus eating. Eating there is part of the avodah almost. Eating is a preparation. It concludes the kapara, the eating of the kohanim of karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. That brought kapara to the people who brought those karbanos. So the Gemara says, okay, but not only does it say that they slept in that they weren't allowed to sleep in it, it implies that they were allowed to walk around in it. So if they walked around in it, that's also okay. So the Gemara says, no, it doesn't mean that they walked around in it. It means that it's coming to tell me that they didn't sleep in it, not because they were allowed to do other things. They didn't sleep in it. It wants to tell me that they folded it and put it under their heads. Now, the Gemara on the next daf will explain why putting it under the heads itself does not count as using Bigdei Kahuna for your own purposes.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.